He called her a mistake. 5 years later, he saw her in a restaurant with their daughter and realized the real mistake was leaving. Alexander Miller had spent his entire adult life believing that emotions were obstacles, distractions that weakened men who dared to dream of power. From the moment he took over his first company at 25, he had cultivated an image of precision and control, a man untouchable by the sentiment that ruined others. He built his empire like a fortress, brick by brick, fueled by ambition and a relentless pursuit of success. So when Claire, his assistant with her golden hair and piercing blue eyes, stood in his office one afternoon with trembling hands and whispered that she was pregnant, Alexander felt nothing but annoyance. He did not pause to consider her fear or the enormity of what she was telling him. Instead, he dismissed her with the sharp efficiency he applied to failed deals. "You are a mistake," he told her coldly, his tone as flat as if he were ending a contract. The words cut deeper than he realized, but he walked away, convincing himself that he had avoided weakness. For Claire, the words shattered the fragile hope she had carried in her chest. She had loved him, or at least thought she did, mistaking his confidence and drive for strength of character. In that moment she saw only ice in his eyes, only contempt where she had once believed there was connection. Her knees nearly gave out as she left the office, tears burning at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let him see her break. By the time she reached the street, her grief had turned into something else, something harder. She touched her stomach gently, feeling the faintest flutter of life inside her, and made a vow that she would not crumble, that no matter how painful the road ahead might be, she would carry this child with every ounce of strength she had left. In the weeks that followed, Claire's life began to unravel, but she faced each new challenge with quiet determination. Rent notices piled up on her kitchen counter, her body ached from long hours spent waiting tables to cover bills, and fear clawed at her every night when she lay awake staring at the ceiling. Yet even as exhaustion consumed her, she pressed her hand to her belly and whispered promises to the tiny being growing inside her. She promised safety, love, and devotion. She promised that even if the father had chosen power over them, she would choose her child over everything else. Those whispers became her strength, turning her fear into resolve. Alexander, meanwhile, barely gave her another thought. He buried himself in board meetings, acquisition deals, and nights spent networking with people whose approval he craved. He told himself that he had dodged a disaster, that Claire would fade into the background of his memory like a passing storm. Yet deep in the quiet hours of the night, when he stood in front of the vast windows of his penthouse staring down at the city, he sometimes felt a strange tug in his chest. He silenced it quickly, convincing himself that vulnerability was poison and that he was better off unencumbered. To him, family was not a legacy worth building, it was an anchor that dragged men into mediocrity. But for Claire, life was already changing in irrevocable ways. The loneliness of carrying a child without support pressed heavily on her, but so did the miracle of it. Each doctor's appointment brought new clarity, first the soft rhythm of a heartbeat that made her cry silently into her hands, then the grainy image of her child forming on the screen, and later the powerful kicks that startled her in the middle of the night. Every milestone reminded her that she was no longer alone, that her world was expanding in ways Alexander could never understand. She decorated a corner of her modest apartment with second-hand furniture, painting the old crib she found at a thrift store and sewing tiny blankets late at night when she should have been resting. She had no one to lean on, no safety net, but she was building something far more meaningful than the empire Alexander worshipped. As her belly grew and strangers' stares turned from curiosity to judgment, Claire learned to walk with her head held high. People whispered about her being alone, about her foolishness in loving a man like Alexander, but she no longer let their words pierce her. She carried within her something purer than all their scorn, the knowledge that she was bringing life into the world, a life that would one day prove to be her greatest source of strength. Though she cried when no one was watching and trembled when the bills mounted higher than her wages, she never considered abandoning her child. If anything, Alexander's cruelty had lit a fire inside her, one that drove her forward with a determination she never knew she possessed. By the end of those first months, Claire had already transformed. The fragile woman who had walked into Alexander's office trembling with fear no longer existed. In her place was someone stronger, forged in pain and sacrifice, someone who knew that the road ahead would be hard but worth every step. She did not need Alexander's money or his approval. She had something far greater than his cold empire. She had love, the kind of love that asked for nothing in return, that was fierce and unyielding, that would carry her and her child through whatever storms were yet to come. As the months of her pregnancy moved forward, Claire found herself navigating a world that felt both hostile and miraculous. Her body grew heavier, every step more exhausting, and yet each flutter inside her reminded her why she endured the pain and sleepless nights. The restaurant where she worked became both a lifeline and a battlefield. She needed the paycheck, but the hours on her feet made her ankles swell until they ached deep into the night. Some customers smiled at her kindly, asking about the baby with genuine warmth, but others whispered cruelly, throwing glances that suggested judgment about a young woman raising a child alone. Claire trained herself to keep her chin lifted, to focus on the sound of her daughter's heartbeat echoing in her memory from the doctor's office, and to let the whispers fall away like dust. At home, her apartment became a patchwork of hope and struggle. Bills piled up on the table beside half-finished sewing projects. She collected second-hand clothes for the baby, carefully washing each piece, mending small tears, and folding them neatly into drawers as if they were priceless treasures. Friends offered what little help they could, a bag of diapers here, a set of bottles there, but most nights she sat alone on her couch, her hands on her belly, whispering to the child within. She told stories about the world outside, described the flowers in the park and the taste of fresh bread, and promised that no matter how little they had, love would always be abundant. Her pregnancy was not without complications. There were nights when sharp pains brought her to tears, when fear wrapped around her throat and left her gasping. More than once she ended up in the emergency room, clutching her belly as doctors monitored the baby's heartbeat. Each time she left shaken, but stronger, determined not to let fear win. The doctors warned her that stress and exhaustion could harm both her and the child, but what choice did she have? To survive she had to keep working, had to keep moving, had to keep fighting. She learned to breathe through the fear, to steady herself with the knowledge that every challenge brought her closer to meeting her daughter. The day of the birth arrived on a cold, rainy evening. Claire had been working a long shift when the contractions began, waves of pain that left her doubled over in the kitchen of the restaurant. Her co-workers rushed her into a cab, and by the time she reached the hospital, her body was already trembling from the force of labor. Hours blurred together as she cried out, gripping the rails of the bed, sweat pouring down her face. There was no hand holding hers, no soothing voice whispering encouragement, only the brisk commands of nurses and doctors guiding her through. Her body felt like it was breaking apart, and yet beneath the agony was a strange sense of triumph. She was about to meet the one person who made every sacrifice worthwhile. When the wail of her newborn daughter finally filled the room, Claire's sobs broke free in a torrent she couldn't control. The nurse placed a tiny, squirming bundle in her arms, and as she looked down at the child's face for the first time, the world seemed to stop. The baby had a shock of dark hair and eyes that opened slowly, revealing a bright, piercing blue. Claire gasped, her heart twisting painfully. Those were Alexander's eyes, clear as day, but softer, filled not with cruelty but with innocence. She kissed the baby's forehead again and again, whispering through her tears, "Lily. My Lily." In that moment, all the loneliness and abandonment seemed to dissolve. The child in her arms was proof that she was not broken, not worthless, not a mistake. She had created life, and that life would give her the strength to face whatever came next. She held Lily close, rocking her gently as exhaustion threatened to pull her under, and whispered vows that only a mother could make. She would never let anyone hurt her daughter, she would never let her feel unwanted, and she would never, ever leave her. When Claire was discharged from the hospital, she carried Lily into their tiny apartment with tears streaming down her face. She placed her in the crib she had painted by hand, the one with chipped corners and mismatched bedding, and sat beside it with a heart so full she thought it might burst. Outside the rain still fell, but inside the apartment a new light had taken root. Claire no longer cared about Alexander's rejection, nor about the whispers of strangers. She had something far greater than any of them could understand. She had her daughter, and with her came a new strength that no one, not even Alexander, could take away. The first years of Lily's life became a test of endurance that pushed Claire to her limits, yet they also held moments of joy so bright they burned away the shadows of her struggles. The nights were the hardest at first. Lily was colicky, waking every hour with cries that pierced the silence of the small apartment and left Claire stumbling out of bed half asleep. She would walk the floor for hours, rocking the tiny bundle against her chest, whispering lullabies and prayers for peace. Some nights she wept alongside her daughter, the exhaustion so heavy it felt like her bones might shatter beneath its weight, but the moment Lily's cries softened into sleep, a wave of fierce love would wash over her, reminding her why she had chosen to keep fighting. By day, life demanded even more of her. Claire returned to work as soon as she could, leaving Lily with a kind elderly neighbor who had offered to watch her while she waited tables. The separation felt like a physical ache, and she often rushed home after long shifts to scoop her daughter into her arms and breathe in the sweet scent of baby powder and milk. Money was constantly short, and Claire learned how to stretch every dollar, cutting coupons, shopping at thrift stores, and sometimes skipping meals so that Lily never went hungry. The stress was relentless, yet Claire clung to the image of her daughter's bright eyes and growing smile as proof that every sacrifice was worth it. As Lily grew from a baby into a toddler, the apartment filled with laughter and chaos. Claire taped Lily's colorful crayon drawings to the walls, turning peeling paint into a gallery of innocence. Toys cluttered every corner, mismatched and second-hand, but they brought life into the space in a way nothing else could. Lily's first steps came on a quiet afternoon when Claire had collapsed onto the couch after work. She looked up just in time to see her daughter wobbling toward her on unsteady legs, arms outstretched. The shock and joy that surged through Claire left her crying and laughing at once as she caught the little girl in her arms. Every milestone after that felt like a triumph not just for Lily, but for both of them. Still, there were nights when Claire lay awake, staring at the ceiling while Lily slept peacefully beside her, haunted by the absence of the man who had denied them. She hated herself for it, but she sometimes wondered what it would have been like if Alexander had stayed. Would Lily have grown up surrounded by comfort instead of scarcity, with a father to guide her and a mother who wasn't stretched thin by exhaustion? But then she would look at her daughter's sleeping face, at the way her chest rose and fell with perfect innocence, and remind herself that she had chosen the better path. She would rather raise Lily in poverty filled with love than in wealth poisoned by cruelty. Lily's personality bloomed early. She was curious and fearless, a child who asked endless questions and ran toward every new adventure with wide eyes. Her favorite spot was the park near their apartment, where she would race across the playground with uncontainable energy, her laughter echoing through the air. Other parents would smile at her, and some would glance at Claire with pity, noticing she was always alone. But Claire learned to ignore the stares. She focused instead on Lily's joy, on the way her daughter's blue eyes sparkled when she discovered something new, on the way she would curl up in her lap at night and whisper, "I love you, Mommy." Despite the hardships, Claire built a world where Lily felt safe and cherished. Birthdays were celebrated with homemade cakes, candles stuck into lopsided frosting, and gifts carefully chosen from bargain bins but wrapped with care. At Christmas, they decorated a tiny tree Claire had found discarded on the curb, stringing it with paper chains and twinkling lights from a thrift store. To Lily, it was magical, and to Claire, it was proof that joy could be created from nothing more than love and determination. All the while, Alexander remained a ghost in their lives. Claire never spoke his name, though she could not deny his presence in Lily's features. The dark hair, the sharp jawline, and most of all the piercing blue eyes reminded her every day of what he had chosen to abandon. Sometimes Lily would point to men on the street and ask if one of them was her father, and Claire would smile tightly and shake her head, her heart aching. "He's far away," she would say softly, though in truth he was only a few miles across the city, hidden behind glass towers and boardrooms. Even as the years passed, Claire refused to let bitterness consume her. She poured all of her strength into raising Lily, into teaching her kindness, resilience, and the belief that she was deeply loved. And though loneliness still crept into Claire's heart in quiet moments, she knew that her daughter had filled the void left by Alexander's cruelty. What had once been a story of abandonment had transformed into one of survival and fierce devotion. For Claire, those early years forged her into someone stronger than she had ever believed she could be. For Lily, they laid the foundation of a childhood where love mattered more than anything money could buy. And though neither of them could know it yet, the time was coming when the carefully built walls between their world and Alexander's would begin to crack, and the truth that had been buried for years would finally find its way into the light. While Claire's life had been consumed by diapers, night shifts, and the tender chaos of raising a child alone, Alexander Miller's world had transformed into a glittering empire that only reinforced his belief that he had made the right choice. In the years following Claire's departure from his life, his company expanded at a staggering pace, acquiring rivals and launching into international markets. His face appeared regularly in business magazines, hailed as the young visionary who had redefined corporate strategy. Investors clamored for his attention, competitors feared his next move, and politicians sought his favor. From the outside, Alexander looked like a man who had it all: power, wealth, influence, and the enviable lifestyle that came with it. But beneath the glossy surface, cracks had already begun to form. His schedule was a relentless march of board meetings, dinners with clients, and endless flights across the globe. Each achievement felt momentarily satisfying but was quickly followed by an emptiness that gnawed at him when the applause faded. He lived in penthouses with panoramic views and dined in restaurants where the bill for one evening equaled what Claire once struggled to earn in a month. Yet when he returned home after midnight, the silence of his luxurious apartment pressed down on him with a weight that no success could lighten. Alexander filled that silence with distraction. There was always a new woman on his arm at events, beautiful and glamorous, but none ever stayed. They admired his wealth and basked in the glow of his success, but they never looked at him the way Claire once had, with eyes that saw more than the surface. He told himself that he didn't care, that intimacy was unnecessary, that women were interchangeable and temporary. Still, every so often, he found himself haunted by the memory of Claire's blue eyes. He would remember the way she had looked at him with trust and something deeper, something that no one else had ever offered him since. He dismissed those thoughts quickly, convincing himself that weakness had no place in his life, but the memories lingered like shadows that refused to fade. His family background, which he never spoke of, only hardened his resolve to remain detached. His father had been a cold man, obsessed with discipline and appearances, while his mother had retreated into silence long before Alexander was old enough to understand why. Love had never been abundant in his childhood, and success had been the only currency that earned approval. When he looked at himself in the mirror now, he saw a man who had surpassed his father's achievements, who had carved his own place at the top. But what he refused to acknowledge was the hollowness that mirrored the very life he had once despised. On the rare occasions when he allowed himself to slow down, the silence unsettled him. He would stand by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, a glass of whiskey in hand, staring down at the endless lights of the city. The towers below glowed like beacons of his accomplishments, yet he often felt an inexplicable restlessness, as though something essential was missing. His assistants whispered that he was ruthless, his partners called him brilliant, but none of them knew the gnawing emptiness that filled his chest late at night. Sometimes, when exhaustion stripped away his defenses, he wondered if success meant anything at all if no one waited for him at home. The more Alexander built, the more he found himself questioning what it was all for. But he was too proud, too hardened, to admit such thoughts even to himself. To the world, he was unshakable, the man who never faltered, who had no regrets. Yet the truth was far more complicated. He remembered Claire not only because she had challenged him in ways others never did, but because she had offered him something he had buried deep within himself, the possibility of love, of belonging. He had thrown it away, convinced it was weakness, and now, though he tried to ignore it, he sometimes felt the cost of that decision pressing down on him like a debt unpaid. Even as he continued to climb higher, the emptiness never left him. And though he didn't know it, the world he had built so carefully was about to collide with the one he had abandoned, and the hollow spaces in his life would finally be confronted in a way that no business triumph or glamorous distraction could shield him from. It was a crisp autumn evening when Alexander walked into the restaurant that would change everything. He had chosen the place for its exclusivity, a polished jewel in the city where deals were sealed over candlelight and champagne. The maitre d' greeted him with deference, escorting him to a corner table where a potential investor was already waiting. Alexander slid into his chair with the same confidence he carried into every room, prepared to dissect numbers and negotiate terms. The conversation flowed smoothly at first, talk of profit margins and market expansions filling the air, but as the waiter poured the wine, a sound cut through the polished murmur of the restaurant that made him pause. It was the laughter of a child, bright, unrestrained, and achingly pure. He almost dismissed it, until his gaze drifted across the room. At a table not far from his own sat a woman with golden hair that shimmered in the low light, her blue eyes soft with a tenderness he hadn't seen in years. For a moment, his breath caught, and the polished words of his investor blurred into meaningless noise. Claire. She looked older, perhaps a little thinner, but there was a glow about her that unsettled him. She wasn't alone. Next to her, perched on a chair too large for her small frame, sat a little girl. She was around 5 years old, with a cascade of dark hair and a pair of piercing blue eyes that seemed to shine like twin flames. Alexander's world tilted, and the walls he had spent years building around himself cracked in a single heartbeat. He could not look away. Every detail of the child struck him like a blow. The tilt of her chin, the shape of her nose, the unmistakable color of her eyes, they were his. It was as if he were staring at a reflection of himself, softened by innocence, untarnished by arrogance or pride. The girl laughed again, clutching a fork too big for her hands, and Claire reached out to steady her, smiling with a warmth that made Alexander's chest ache. It was a picture so ordinary yet so profound that it shook him to his core, a mother and daughter sharing dinner, a scene he had denied himself without even realizing it. For the first time in years, Alexander felt his confidence falter. His investor was speaking, gesturing toward some figure on the contract, but the words fell flat. Alexander's gaze remained locked on the table across the room. He thought of the day Claire had stood in his office, trembling as she told him she was pregnant, and of his own cold response. "You are a mistake." The memory burned hotter than the whiskey he drank on sleepless nights, and as he watched the child he knew was his, a wave of regret surged through him with such intensity that he gripped the edge of the table to steady himself. Claire hadn't noticed him yet. She leaned toward the little girl, cutting her food into smaller bites, whispering something that made the child giggle again. The sight was unbearable in its beauty and its cruelty. This was the life he had thrown away, not only the woman who had once loved him, but the daughter he had never met, the child he had abandoned before she even drew her first breath. The realization was a knife twisting in his chest. When Claire finally looked up, their eyes met across the room. For a moment, time stopped. Her expression hardened instantly, the warmth that had lit her face vanishing as if a shadow had swept across it. There was no surprise in her gaze, only recognition and a guarded strength that told him she had built a life without him and did not welcome his intrusion. She turned back to her daughter quickly, her hand brushing through the little girl's hair as though to shield her from the man staring across the room. Alexander forced himself to focus on the conversation at his own table, but the words meant nothing. His mind was consumed by the image of Claire and the child. When the meal ended and his guest departed, Alexander remained seated, staring into the dregs of his untouched wine. For the first time in his life, he questioned everything he had built. The empire he had fought for felt hollow compared to the sound of that little girl's laughter. As he left the restaurant that night, the city lights seemed colder than usual. He returned to his penthouse, but the silence that had once been his refuge now felt suffocating. The ghost of Claire's eyes, filled with quiet defiance, and the vision of his daughter's smile followed him into the night. He lay awake for hours, haunted by a truth he could no longer ignore. He had not cut out weakness when he walked away from Claire, he had cut out his own heart. The following morning Alexander woke with a heaviness he had not felt in years, a weight pressing against his chest that no amount of exercise, work, or whiskey could burn away. He sat at the edge of his bed staring at the skyline through the wide glass windows, but the view of the city that once filled him with pride now felt meaningless. His mind would not let go of the image of the little girl in the restaurant. Her laughter echoed in his ears, her blue eyes haunted him with their familiarity, and the memory of Claire's guarded expression burned into him like a scar reopened. For the first time in his life, Alexander Miller did not want another deal, another headline, or another conquest. He wanted answers. He wanted to undo what could not be undone. He told himself he needed proof, though deep down he already knew. He spent the day in a haze, signing contracts and nodding through boardroom discussions while his thoughts wandered back to the restaurant. As the evening approached, he found himself walking into the same place again without even fully deciding to go there. He scanned the room with a mixture of hope and dread, and when he saw them, Claire with her golden hair tied back, the little girl swinging her legs beneath the table while talking animatedly, his breath caught once more. He stood frozen for a long moment before gathering the courage to move toward them. Claire noticed him immediately. Her smile faded, her posture stiffening as though she had been bracing for this moment all along. She placed a protective hand on her daughter's shoulder and whispered something that made the girl turn her attention back to her meal. When Alexander reached their table, Claire's eyes lifted to his, and in them he saw no trace of the affection that had once lived there. Instead, he saw steel and pain forged over years of abandonment. "Claire," he began, his voice lower than he intended, almost uncertain. For a man who had commanded boardrooms and dictated the fate of entire companies, he suddenly felt like a boy stripped bare. She did not offer a greeting. Her gaze held his with cold clarity. "Don't," she said sharply. "You don't get to walk over here and pretend you care." He swallowed hard, struggling to find words. "She's mine," he whispered, glancing at the child. It wasn't a question. Claire's lips pressed into a tight line. "She's mine," she replied. Her tone carried both defiance and a quiet tremor of hurt. "You made it clear years ago that you wanted no part of her life. You don't get to change your mind just because you finally saw what you threw away." The girl looked up at that moment, curious about the tension in her mother's voice, and Alexander felt his heart stutter. He forced a smile, wanting to speak to her, but Claire's hand tightened on her daughter's shoulder. "Eat your food, sweetheart," she said softly. The girl nodded and turned back to her plate, and Claire's eyes snapped back to Alexander with a force that nearly knocked the breath out of him. "I was young, I was stupid," Alexander said, his voice rough with desperation he barely recognized. "I thought." "You thought I was a mistake," Claire interrupted, her words sharp as glass. "Do you remember?" "Because I do. Every day. I had to look at my daughter and know her father threw her away before she even had a chance to live. You don't get to erase that, Alexander. You don't get to rewrite history just because your conscience suddenly woke up." Her words pierced him deeper than any business rival ever had. He felt the truth in them, undeniable and crushing. He had built his life on decisions made with ruthless logic, but this was not a market or a merger he could control. This was a wound he had inflicted, and it bled in front of him in the form of a child who had his eyes and a woman who had once loved him enough to beg him to stay. "I just want to know her," he said finally, his voice breaking on the last word. Claire shook her head, her jaw trembling though her gaze remained firm. "You don't deserve her. She doesn't need the kind of love that can vanish with a signature. She doesn't need a man who chooses power over family. She has me. That's enough." He wanted to argue, to beg, to fall to his knees in the middle of the restaurant, but the cold truth in her words silenced him. For the first time in his life, Alexander understood that his power meant nothing here. Money couldn't buy back trust, and influence couldn't undo the choices he had made. Claire turned back to her daughter, ending the conversation with finality. "Go," she said quietly but firmly, without even glancing at him. "Go back to your world, Alexander. Ours is better without you." He stood there for a long moment, his chest aching as though she had reached inside and ripped something vital from him. At last, he stepped back, his pride in tatters, his carefully crafted image of control shattered. As he left the restaurant, he felt the stares of others on his back, but for once he did not care. He walked into the night carrying the unbearable truth that no deal, no empire, and no empire of glass and steel could ever heal the wound he had carved into his own life. But the image of that little girl's eyes, his eyes, refused to fade. And though Claire had told him to leave, Alexander knew he couldn't. Something inside him had shifted forever. The man who had once believed love was weakness now realized the greatest weakness of all had been believing he could live without it. Alexander had spent his entire life chasing power, but after the encounter in the restaurant, he found himself chasing something entirely different. The image of the little girl's blue eyes lingered with him no matter how many deals he signed or how many miles he traveled. It became impossible to bury himself in contracts and numbers when, in the quiet moments, he could still hear her laughter cutting through the noise of the world he had built. He began to realize that the emptiness he had carried for years was not just loneliness, it was the absence of a life he had denied. And for the first time in his career, Alexander Miller found himself distracted, unable to care about the next big merger when all he wanted was another glimpse of the child he had never known. It started innocently, or at least he told himself it did. He discovered that Claire often took her daughter to a nearby park after school, a place with swings and a carousel that overlooked a small pond. He would leave his office earlier than usual, trading the comfort of polished boardrooms for the sight of children racing across playgrounds. He would sit on a bench at a distance, his expensive suit looking out of place among the parents and nannies, and watch as the little girl he now knew was named Lily climbed the jungle gym or ran to her mother with drawings in her hands. Alexander was careful not to be noticed at first, content to simply watch, though every fiber of his being longed to walk forward and speak. The first time he heard Lily's voice up close was a moment that nearly unraveled him. She had tripped while running and scraped her knee, and Claire rushed to her side, soothing her with gentle words. Alexander wanted nothing more than to do the same, to kneel beside her and comfort her, but he remained frozen on the bench, his hands clenched into fists. He realized then how much of her life he had missed, her first steps, her first words, every moment that should have been his to share. The regret was a constant ache, but it was also what fueled his determination. Eventually, fate gave him an opening. One afternoon, Claire stepped away briefly to take a call, leaving Lily on the swings. The little girl struggled to get the swing moving, her small legs kicking against the dirt. Without thinking, Alexander rose from his bench and approached slowly, his heart pounding. He asked softly, "Do you want a push?" She looked up at him with curious eyes, tilting her head the way children do when deciding whether someone is safe. After a pause, she nodded. He placed his hands gently on the swing's chains and gave a careful push. Lily laughed as the swing rose, the sound so pure it nearly undid him. From that moment, their small interactions grew. She began to recognize him, greeting him with a shy smile whenever he appeared at the park. He would bring little things, ice cream cones from a nearby vendor or a balloon, gestures that made her eyes light up. Alexander found himself listening more than speaking, content to let her fill the air with stories about school, her favorite books, and the friends she played with. She showed him her drawings, messy but filled with bright colors, and he accepted each one as though it were a priceless gift. He marveled at her imagination, her resilience, and her unshakable joy. Yet every joy carried its shadow. One afternoon, Lily tilted her head at him with childlike curiosity and asked, "Do you know my daddy?" The question pierced him more deeply than any accusation could. He struggled to form words, his throat tightening as guilt clawed at him. "Not as well as I should," he managed finally, his voice low. Lily seemed satisfied with the answer, skipping away to chase after a butterfly, but Alexander stood rooted to the spot, shaken by the innocence of her question. He realized that to her, he was just a kind stranger, a man who appeared sometimes at the park. She had no idea that he was her father, the one who had abandoned her before she was even born. Claire, however, was not blind. She noticed his presence, noticed the small gifts, noticed Lily's growing fondness for him. One evening as she gathered her daughter's things, she looked directly at him, her expression sharp and unyielding. "This doesn't change anything," she said quietly, her voice firm enough to make his stomach twist. "You don't get to stroll back into her life as though the past didn't happen." He wanted to argue, to tell her that he was trying, that he was different now, but the words caught in his throat. All he could do was nod, knowing she was right. Still, he couldn't stay away. Every encounter with Lily was both a gift and a punishment. He cherished the moments she laughed with him, but each one reminded him of the years he had lost. He knew trust could not be rebuilt overnight, and he understood that Claire's anger was justified. But he also knew one truth above all else: he loved his daughter. It was a love fierce enough to humble him, powerful enough to drive him to keep coming back no matter how coldly Claire pushed him away. For the first time in his life, Alexander Miller was no longer chasing power or wealth. He was chasing redemption, though he didn't yet know whether it was something he could ever truly earn. What he did know was that he would not walk away again.